Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about the higher level topics. I'm going to start off with the Soviet Union between 1924 and 2000. So essentially what we're going to be doing today is looking at each of the, dictators essentially that took over in the Soviet Union between 1924 and 2000. So it starts with Stalin, moves on to Khrushchev, then of course Brezhnev, and then we're going to talk about the stagnation under Andropov, later Gorbachev, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, in each case, we're going to talk about how each leader came to power, what their policies were, how they would shape the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union on the whole. So let's go ahead and start off with Stalin. Now in Stalin's case, it wasn't so much that he made himself the person with all the power, so much as the communists had already centralized power. More accurately, the Bolsheviks had centralized power. In fact, they had fought a very lengthy and surprisingly violent civil war. It's actually not covered that much in most history curricula, but they had done so and they had put themselves at the center of Russian power. So they had really centralized the power structure in their favor. Essentially, what this meant was that Stalin really just had to make sure that he was the one at the head of this power structure. And he managed to do that. So really what Stalin did for the most part was manipulate inner party politics to put himself at the top. What this meant essentially was taking advantage of his position as party secretary and making sure that he was responsible for all the appointments for the people that were actually in the Bolshevik party, and making sure that the people in the party were close to him and not close to Trotsky or any of his other rivals. So essentially what this meant was that Stalin manipulated inner party politics to get ahead. So there are quite a few names to keep track of, but essentially Stalin would ally himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev, and he would eventually turn other members of the party away from Trotsky. He would also approach Lenin while Lenin's health was very weak, and he was the only person who had contact with Lenin. He saw to this, and he made sure that Lenin's very earnest desire to move away from Stalin, because Stalin was considered brutish and impolite, and to transition to a more democratic system was rebuffed. And he even made sure that Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, wasn't able to communicate with the party. He boxed her out, and he made sure she wasn't really part of the political process. This was actually very conniving of him, and he took advantage of a number of things. The first thing he took advantage of was the divisions in the party. Like many revolutionary movements, the communist movement in Russia was splintered. Now, Lenin had tried to create a ban on factionalism in 1921 to make sure that there wasn't that many smaller groups within the Communist Party. What this meant, however, was that there wasn't as much opposition to Stalin. So another thing he took advantage of was the fact that a lot of the members of the Communist Party were career politicians. These were men who simply cared about their positions of power and weren't as concerned with advancing the revolution. So really, they just wanted to climb the ladder and get higher in terms of the hierarchy. Stalin was able to take advantage of this, and once again, men like Zinoviev and Kamenev really helped him, because all they thought was that they were tricking the other communists and getting themselves more power. In reality, they were helping Stalin become more powerful. So by the 30s, Stalin had managed to create a government structure filled with people sympathetic to him, to the degree where most of them were essentially spineless yes men that did whatever Stalin thought was fit and didn't really question him. And it started off when he was still gaining power with sort of pushing people out of positions and exiles, and it moved on in the 30s to purges, where people were arrested and killed, often after show trials where they were asked to confess that they had been plotting against the Soviet state. So after this, in the 30s, Stalin becomes very isolationist. He doesn't really participate in many of the major interwar events. It's not to say that he isolated completely, but he didn't really want as much to do. And this was reinforced by the fact that the Allied powers also didn't want much to do with Russia. So this was really significant because it meant that Stalin was focusing much more on internal Russian policy. So right up until 41, Stalin was enforcing his 5-year plans. And the point of the 5-year plans was to rapidly move forward. Of course, like any other dictator, Stalin was maintaining a heavy focus on attempting to reform the system. And when I say reform the system, I mean, of course, to centralize power in his hands, to murder and displace any dissidents, and to create a very rigid structure with centralized power. Of course, not to mention propaganda, brainwashing of the people in many cases, through actual party mechanisms, and creating a system of informants, secret police, everything really designed to lower internal dissent to Stalin as much as humanly possible. So this was very important to keep track of. Now, what Stalin did past this point was ensure that he was essentially at the center of Russian power, and he manipulated Russian politics to keep himself at the forefront of major events. He even went back and edited a lot of Russian propaganda to show that he had a much bigger role in the Bolshevik Revolution than he ultimately did. So, in 41, of course, Hitler invades, Stalin is woefully unprepared, and Russia ends up suffering major losses. Easily the biggest losses in World War II were sustained by the Russians. What Stalin did, essentially, was he was paralyzed with fear for the first few days. He would later enforce much more strict laws that forced his men to fight no matter what, and women in many cases, and he essentially made sure that his people had to fight, or else they would be executed for mutiny and or treason. The executive orders were very instrumental. Also, he managed to become very aggressive in his fighting tactics. He also had a lot more generals put in, and he gave them more of a free rein. So during the war, Stalin kind of backed off and loosened his grip, because you see the very short-sighted behavior he had done in the era of the purges meant that a lot of his top military minds had been removed. Stalin had rightfully predicted, well, not rightfully, let's say Stalin had a very accurate fear of military men, because historically most coups d'etats are by military generals. If you control the people who have the military strength, then you are most likely going to be able to have a bigger sense of control. So military men are pretty dangerous in that sense, but in Stalin's case, whether or not they really were plotting against him was irrelevant. He had them executed. So essentially, Stalin, had a very big focus on making people fight, whether or not they liked it. B, he took a smaller role in military planning. He acknowledged that he wasn't a good military strategist, and he let the army do what it wanted. He kind of pulled back. And C, he made sure to keep industrial production up. He moved a lot of industrial centers to the east. He actually had people dismantle a lot of factory parts and move them on trucks and on horseback in many cases, up into mountainous areas that weren't as easy to attack. And he kept industrial production. So when the Germans finally stalled in Stalingrad, he was able to step up industrial production and finally mount a counteroffensive, which pushed them back. And eventually, Stalin was the one who liberated, not liberated, but invaded Germany and ended World War II. So the thing about it is, after that, of course, we have the Yalta and Potsdam conferences and the beginning of the Cold War, as well as the formation of the Eastern Bloc and the Berlin Wall. So Stalin was pretty hands-on at this point, and Stalin really created a stranglehold over the Eastern European states, forcing them to adopt communism and forcing them to sort of become part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. So what happened at this stage was that Stalin made sure that any elections in these countries were in favor of communist parties, and he made sure that the people in charge, much like the people in Russia itself, were people that were sympathetic to him and people that actually did what it was that he wanted. So at this point, Stalin had managed to create a new system of Sovietization, which ended in 1953 with his death. So past this point, Khrushchev becomes the premier, and there was also a struggle for power. Now, Khrushchev himself was one of the yes men he had put in power. He was not a particularly strong-willed man, but unlike Stalin, he wasn't as cruel or as destructive. So there was initially tripartite, and what happened was it was Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, Molotov, Nikolai Bulganin, and Khrushchev. Slowly, he kind of imitated Stalin, and he managed to push the other men out, and he managed to take over a leadership position. Now, the thing with Khrushchev was that Khrushchev was arguably the only real reformer that came after Stalin. Khrushchev loosened a lot of the grip that Stalin had managed to create over Russia. He managed to free a lot of political prisoners, and he also tried creating new reforms. And the main political reforms were his virgin land policy, and essentially he tried to expand agriculture out into territories that hadn't been expanded before. It ended up being a pretty big failure, and he tried expanding industry and the space program. Famously, Khrushchev didn't really go anywhere with any of these reforms, and he ended up being fairly unsuccessful on the whole. The thing about Khrushchev is Khrushchev was still kind of trying to maintain the Soviet system. More importantly, the people around Khrushchev were trying to maintain the Soviet system, and the fact that Khrushchev was trying to make waves here really concerned them and made them feel that they were under threat. So Khrushchev ends up getting pushed out and replaced by Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev was a great example of the stagnation. Under Brezhnev, there wasn't really any kind of advancement. Brezhnev figured if it's not broken, don't fix it, which of course is inaccurate. It was broken, very broken. Under Brezhnev, some of the worst political corruption in the Soviet Union took place. While once again, it was better for people in the sense that they weren't under the control of a maniac who was killing people left and right. Brezhnev still had a lot of censorship and a lot of regulation. And what happened is, periodically with Khrushchev and Brezhnev, people in Eastern Europe felt that they could start asking for reforms of their own. But each time Khrushchev and Brezhnev both in turn would end up mounting these big offensives, literally sending tanks often into the Czech Republic, well, Czechoslovakia at the time, Hungary, and Poland anytime they wanted to sort of liberalize. So really these men wanted to make sure that things stayed as they were. Even Khrushchev, who was a reformer, managed to keep things as even as possible. At the same time, the Cold War raged on, and both men were trying to have as much control as possible, but at the same time, they tried to negotiate more with the Westerners. So what happens essentially is Khrushchev takes over in 85, and between 85 and 1991, Khrushchev starts pushing more for limited privatization, and he tries to become more open and more democratic. The problem with this was there was not really a lot under the system. It was a crumbling system. So perestroika decentralized the economic planning, but the problem was centralized economic planning had created a structure where people were relying on centralized planning. Loosening that meant that there was nothing at the center anymore, and there wasn't really any kind of central planning, which actually had problems. He also had demokratizatsiya, and this was his democratic reform, and glasnost, which meant openness. So the problem was, of course, there was really very little that could be made democratic about the system. It was a fundamentally flawed system. More importantly, after glasnost, there was a lot of revelation about how corrupt the Soviet system had actually been. So rather than making the Soviet system more open, which is what Gorbachev intended, he had actually exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system. So afterwards, of course, a lot of members of the Soviet Union tried planning a coup d'etat and removing Gorbachev. Unfortunately, the damage had been done. Mass protests and demonstrations broke out all over the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Soviets finally realized that there was no chance of maintaining their system, and they bowed down to international pressure. And finally, in 91, the wall came down and global communism as we know it fell. So it's important to sort of see what it was that took down communism at the end and why Gorbachev failed. So number one was that it was a system that never really moved forward. Consumer prices and goods remained stagnant. The problem was there was still a lot of push when people tried to reform. So you had, on the one hand, this really broken and antiquated and archaic system, and on the other, every time someone tried to make a change, there was a lot of resistance. Not just that, Stalin had managed to influence a lot of ordinary Soviet citizens into believing that he was the man who had made things right. Past that, really just the belief that it was impossible to reform the Soviet system, that there was really very little that could be done to fix the Soviet system. So, to sum up, Stalin, consolidation of control, massive power siphoning. Khrushchev, trying to fix things but not trying hard enough and ending up falling flat. Brezhnev, just giving jobs through the nomenclatura system to all his buddies and remaining corrupt and uninterested. Gorbachev trying to fix it but ultimately really realizing it could not be fixed. So that's a pretty good, very brief overview of the Soviet Union between 1924 and 2000. Thank you.